我是海上的风，我是浪花拍岸的涌动，我是海潮的低语，我是7座山巅的雄牛，我是峭壁上盘旋的鹰，我是旭日初升的泪珠，我是娇嫩的花朵，我是勇猛的野猪，我是池中的鲑鱼，我是原野上的湖泊，我是记忆之言语，我是利刃之尖锋。以上这首诗歌出自《阿梅尔金之歌》。这首诗歌被认为是爱尔兰历史上最早的一首诗歌，从凯尔特诗歌到乔伊斯、叶芝的文学经典，从古老的风笛与舞蹈到丰富的艺术表达，爱尔兰人用创造力延续了对美的追求，历史与文学剧场交织在一起，成为了爱尔兰文化里面独特的灵魂。那么在接下来的节目当中呢，为了更好地了解爱尔兰文学，我们将走进他们的历史看一看。让我们一起进入今天的对话。Hello, welcome to our show today. Today we are going to talk about a little bit about Irish history because we are going to see a play which is called...
The play is called Juno and the Paycock, and it's on in the West End, starring Mark Rylance. And Juno and the Paycock is one of Sean O'Casey's great plays. So what do you need to know? What do you need to know in order to understand and enjoy the play?
I think definitely something about Irish history.
Okay.
You know, history and literature and theatre are very connected with each other.
They are very connected, yeah.
So I think it's good for our audience to have a brief understanding about the history of Ireland.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And that O'Casey is a good place to explore that. I mean, the way we've always been talking about the history of Ireland, because as you say, the history and the literature are completely interwoven. I mean, I guess they always are.
Always, yeah.
But in a very clear and particular way with Ireland. Because Ireland has got such a complicated and ongoing history of violence and competing forces and big...
Famine.
Well, yeah, the famine for sure, but also just big sort of movements of ideas and philosophy and religion, especially. So it's a very complicated country. Sean O'Casey was writing the early part of the 20th century. So most of his plays were performed the famous plays were performed in the 1920s, and they were talking about historical events that were only just over.
Is it related to the First World War?
Well, yes, in a way. So I don't know, where should we begin? What do you need to know? So yes is the answer to that question. Especially, so Sean O'Casey's play Juno and the Paycock is set during the Irish Civil War.
Irish Civil War.
And the Irish Civil War was the second war, and that was in the 1920s.
Oh.
And the Irish Civil War followed the Irish War of Independence, and the Irish War of Independence followed what's called the Easter Rising.
Easter Rising?
Yes, and Sean O'Casey's plays deal with all of those big events.
Oh.
So they're set during this very tumultuous period of Irish history, which began in 1916 and finally resolved more or less in the 1920s. With the formation of what's called the Irish Free State.
Irish Free State.
And the Irish Free State was when Ireland was very nearly independent from Britain. It finally achieved legal independence in 1949. But in order to get there was a period of intense violence. I mean, Ireland is a very small country with quite a small population. That's partly because in 1848, or between 1845 and 1848, there was a terrible famine. One of the worst famines in human history. And human history contains lots of famines.
I did a research online. They're talking about that famine, and a lot of people moved out from the country.
A lot of people died and a lot of people left. If you talk about the famine, for instance, the famine occurred in that middle of the 19th century because the Irish potato crop failed.
So, is that kind of a disease of potato?
Yeah, a blight.
Blight.
A blight.
A blight.
And unfortunately, the Irish people were heavily dependent on the potato, and heavily dependent on one type of potato. So lots of countries in Europe suffered the potato blight, and some of them suffered famine, but nowhere was as bad as Ireland.
Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are contested, but I think up to 2 or 3 million people died.
At that first time, Ireland was still part of like the British Empire.
Yes. Well, I mean, it was part of Britain. So, I mean, its status, its relationship with England and with Britain had moved over the years. Because when it started being invaded by the British, and that started with the Normans, so more than 1,000 years ago, really, at that point Ireland was lots of different kingdoms, and the kingdoms are very small. So there was never like a nation of Ireland that was invaded by England. It was sort of taken over in bits and pieces. There was, I mean, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's dad, had been quite responsible for that, and then so had Elizabeth, her sister Mary, James I, Charles I. There was this sort of constant. Richard II famously goes to Ireland to try and subdue it. So the Irish were considered to be rebellious because they were Roman Catholic. They were sort of anti-religionists. They were often allies to the French and the Spanish in various ways, who were very much the enemies of England. So the English had always tried to control Ireland and had settled English people there, or Scottish people there, so there's sort of a history of colonisation, especially in the north. And then by the time of the 19th century, it had become part of Great Britain. So when we think about an empire, India was not part of Great Britain, it was part of the British Empire. So it depends how you think about these things, but it was a slightly different thing.
Okay.
But yeah, it was part of Britain, but the British kind of sphere of influence. We'll see. My fear is that the production will...
Too serious?
No, too funny.
Too funny?
Yeah.
Okay.
Intelligent people rarely do too serious.
Oh, that's true. That's very true. That's very true.
So it's quite rare that you see a production which is too serious.
Too serious sometimes means they're not...
Sometimes. Not very clever. Yeah, no,
Clever.
comedy is definitely a function of intelligence. But we'll see.
Looking forward to it.
Cool.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Robert.